Some miracles do not begin in operating rooms. They do not come from prestigious hospitals. They do not appear in thick medical reports or million-dollar machines. Sometimes, a miracle begins in a place most people pass by without a second glance: an old garage on the side of the highway. Jack Turner had lived almost his entire life on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, a town people only remembered when they needed gas or a place to stop along Highway Route 99. Jack's garage sat right beside that dusty road. No large sign, no air-conditioned waiting room, just a cracked concrete floor, worn-out tools, and the smell of engine oil clinging to every corner of the walls. Jack was 44 years old, a man the world had never really noticed. He was not wealthy, not remarkable. He had no degrees or titles that made people stop and listen. But there was one thing no one in this town ever denied. Jack had never cheated a customer, never exaggerated a car's problem, and never turned his back on someone in trouble. That morning was no different from hundreds of others. The harsh California sun, the sound of metal striking metal, engines growling softly before falling silent. Until a sound appeared. Low, smooth, and entirely out of place. A black luxury car slowly came to a stop in front of the garage. Its polished body reflected the sunlight like a mirror. For a moment, Jack thought it had taken a wrong turn. People who drove cars like that never came to his shop. Then the rear door opened. A young woman stepped out, slowly, carefully. Her legs were secured with heavy metal braces. Every step required complete concentration. Her face looked tired, but not weak. Standing beside her was another woman with a presence Jack had only ever seen on television. Confident, composed, and carrying the quiet authority of someone used to doors opening wherever she went. Jack did not know their names, did not know that this meeting would change all three of their lives forever. But at that moment, amid road dust and engine noise, a story larger than any of them had quietly begun. Jack quickly wiped the oil from his hands on a worn-out rag and stepped outside. Sunlight reflected off the glossy black body of the car, forcing him to squint. He didn't need to see the logo to know. The vehicle was worth more than his entire garage put together. The woman standing beside the car turned to look at Jack. Her eyes swept quickly over the surroundings: peeling walls, cracked concrete floor, old cars waiting to be repaired. It wasn't a look of disdain. It was the hesitation of someone unaccustomed to placing hope in such places. "Our car overheated on the highway," she said, her voice calm, though there was tension beneath it. "The driver said this was the nearest garage." Jack nodded without asking anything else. To him, a car was a car. He opened the hood, listened to the metal cooling, and studied every detail the way he had done for over 20 years. But his gaze was drawn to the young woman sitting on a plastic chair outside. The heavy metal braces wrapped around her legs looked almost too much for her slender frame. She sat very straight, as if she were accustomed to not letting her fatigue show. Jack was not a doctor, but he had spent his entire life looking at machines that had been put together the wrong way. And something wasn't right. He closed the hood, then walked toward the young woman, slowly, keeping just enough distance so she wouldn't feel scrutinized. "Those braces." Jack hesitated for a second, then asked very gently, "Do they always make you uncomfortable like that?" The girl looked up, startled. The question, simple, without pity, seemed to touch something profound. I'm used to it," she replied softly. The woman stepped closer and let out a long breath. "Emily suffered a spinal cord injury when she was 10, she said. "We've traveled all across America. Hospitals, specialists, and the best equipment. This is the most advanced thing medicine can offer. Jack didn't argue. He simply lowered himself, asked permission with his eyes, and then carefully examined every metal joint and every pressure point. His brow furrowed slightly, not from despair, but because he had just realized something no one among them had ever considered. Perhaps the problem had never been in the young woman's body at all. Jack knelt slowly, not to inspect, but to meet Emily at eye level. He didn't rush to touch anything. He simply observed, the way he always did whenever an engine made a strange sound, listening before acting. The metal braces hugging Emily's legs looked solid, even refined, yet it was that very perfection that made Jack uneasy. The joints were too rigid. The weight was distributed unevenly. The load-bearing points were in the wrong places, just like a mechanical part assembled correctly on paper, but wrong in reality. He looked up at the woman standing behind her. "Would you mind if I take a closer look?" Jack asked, his voice low and deliberate. Margaret Lawson paused for a moment. She was accustomed to spotless white rooms and people in lab coats speaking in complex terminology. An old garage and a mechanic were not part of any scenario she had ever trusted. But she nodded. Jack touched the braces as gently as if they were something fragile. He tried to rotate one joint. It didn't budge. He tested another, still rigid. He let out a soft breath. "They're not wrong medically," Jack said slowly, as if weighing every word, "but they're wrong mechanically." The air around them seemed to freeze. Margaret immediately stiffened. "Are you saying all the specialists are wrong?" she asked, her voice controlled but her eyes defensive. Jack shook his head. "No, I'm not saying they're wrong." He looked down at Emily's legs once more. "I'm just saying they didn't look at it as a system that's meant to function." Emily listened, her heart beating faster. For the first time, someone wasn't talking about her as a medical case, not talking about limitations, not about what was impossible. Jack continued, his voice low but steady. "Metal, joints, compression, center of gravity. That's what I work with every day. And these," he gestured toward the braces, "are working against her body instead of supporting it." Emily swallowed hard. A strange feeling rose within her, not a grand hope, but a tiny spark, just enough to make her not want to turn away. Margaret remained silent. In her eyes, the doubt was still there, but for the first time in many years, it did not completely overpower something else. A curiosity, mixed with the longing to believe just once more. Margaret Lawson stood still for a long moment. She had heard promises for more than 10 years, from doctors, professors, and leading biomedical engineers. All of them had spoken with absolute confidence, and all of it had ended with the same sentence: "We've done everything we can." She was no longer easy to believe. "Do you know what you're talking about?" Margaret asked, her voice still carrying the composure of someone accustomed to controlling everything. "Those braces were designed by one of the leading medical device companies in the United States." Jack didn't respond right away. He didn't feel offended, nor did he feel the need to defend his ego. He simply rose slowly and wiped his hands on the old cloth in his back pocket. "I believe they did everything they could," Jack said. "But they designed this on a drawing board. And I fix things that are broken in the real world." Emily sat still, her hands pressed firmly on her knees. Her heart pounded harder with every beat. She was used to her mother saying no, not because of a lack of love, but because hope had been raised and shattered too many times. Jack looked at Emily. His gaze was not forceful, not insistent. "If I'm wrong," he said softly, "then I apologize. I'll stop immediately. I don't want to cause you any more pain." He turned to Margaret. "I don't need money. I don't need promises. I'm only asking for one chance to try." The space fell silent. Only the distant sound of traffic from the highway remained. Margaret looked down at her daughter, the little girl who had once run across fields, who had once laughed out loud while riding horses, had grown up, stronger than Margaret had imagined, yet still carrying in her eyes a longing Margaret had tried to shield for so many years. Emily looked up. Her voice trembled slightly, but it was clear. "Mom, just let him try." The words struck the deepest place in a mother's heart. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had come to fear hope more than despair, but this time, something was different. "All right," she said slowly, "but I'll stay here. I'll watch every step." Jack nodded immediately, not a second of hesitation, and in that very moment, not when a brace was removed, but when a mother allowed herself to believe once more, the fate of all three of them began to take a different turn. On the first night, the lights in Jack's garage never went out. As Bakersfield sank into silence, with only the occasional truck passing along Route 99, Jack stood alone at his old workbench. Emily's metal braces were laid neatly in front of him, spread out like a problem with no solution yet. He did not look at them as medical devices. He looked at them as a system that had been assembled incorrectly. Jack removed each bolt, each joint, slowly and carefully. Every component carried the marks of theoretical calculation, elegant, precise, but cold, too heavy, too rigid, too far removed from the natural movement of a real human body. He lifted one metal bar, then set it back down. "Not like this," he muttered as if speaking to himself. On the oil-stained wall behind him, Jack began to draw. White chalk lines crossed over one another. Pivot points, load-bearing areas, directions of weight distribution. There were no complex formulas, only experience accumulated from thousands of engines that had once rested in his hands. By the second night, Jack's eyes were red from lack of sleep, but he kept going. He changed materials and tested lighter alloys. He reshaped the joints so they would move instead of resisting. Each time he thought about the pain Emily endured whenever she tried to stand, his hands tightened even more. He was not angry at the manufacturing company. He was angry at something else. That even with all the money in the world, a young girl still had to accept pain as something inevitable. By the third night, the garage resembled a genuine fabrication workshop. New metal lay interwoven with old parts. Drawings covered the table. Jack sat down on a chair, his back against the wall, and let out a long breath. He wasn't promising a miracle. He hoped for only one straightforward thing: that Emily's body would no longer be betrayed by the very device created to help her. As dawn began to break, Jack stood up, wiped his hands, and looked at the braces, now nearly entirely restructured. He didn't smile. He simply nodded quietly. Because he knew. There are moments in life when a person doesn't need to be confident of success. They only need to know that they have done everything with their whole heart. That morning, Bakersfield was the same as always. The sun rose early. The wind carried the familiar scent of dust from the highway. There was no sign that anything extraordinary was about to happen in the small roadside garage. Margaret arrived with Emily earlier than expected. When they stepped inside, Jack was already waiting. On the metal table in front of him, the new braces lay quietly. Cleaner, lighter, no longer stiff and crude like before. They didn't look like a medical device. They looked like something made for a specific human being. Emily stepped closer. She reached out and lightly touched one of the joints. "So light," she whispered, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might make the feeling disappear. Jack knelt, every movement slow and precise. He helped Emily place her legs into the braces, adjusting each strap. No rushing, no haste. Each time he tightened a strap, he asked, "Is that okay?" Emily nodded. No pain, no pressure. Margaret stood behind them, her hands clasped tightly together. She had witnessed too many trial sessions to dare to hope, but a mother's heart could not stop beating faster. Jack stepped back. "We'll go very slowly," he said, his voice low and steady. "No need to push. Just listen to your body." Emily placed her hands on the walker, took a deep breath, then she shifted her weight onto her legs. She stood up. No wobbling, no groan of pain, no familiar panic. Margaret raised a hand to her mouth. A sound caught in her throat. "Emily?" she whispered. Emily didn't answer right away. She was feeling it. Her weight was being supported correctly. Her legs were no longer fighting her. They were cooperating. "It doesn't hurt," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Mom, it doesn't hurt." Jack didn't move in to help. He stayed where he was, letting her fully experience the moment. Then very slowly, Emily lifted her right foot, placed it down, steady. Her left foot followed. One step, then another. A sob escaped Margaret. She could no longer hold it in. She dropped to her knees, crying like she never had before. Jack turned away for a moment, his eyes burning. Emily laughed, a broken, breathless laugh filled with disbelief. I'm walking." In that small garage amid metal and dust, no one dared to call it a miracle. But all three of them knew. They would never forget this moment. After the first tears were shed, the small garage slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. But the atmosphere was different. Lighter, brighter, as if the place had just witnessed something that even metal and concrete had paused to listen to. Emily sat down to rest for a moment, her hands resting on her knees. She was no longer trembling as before. On her face, astonishment gave way to something new. Trust. Not blind trust, but trust built from real sensations within her own body. Jack stepped closer, adjusted a strap, and loosened a joint just enough. "We'll fine-tune it gradually," he said. "No rush. The body needs time to relearn." Emily nodded. This time, she stood up on her own. She walked slowly from one end of the garage to the other across the concrete floor. Each step was no longer a battle. They became a conversation between her body and the right kind of support. Margaret stood beside her, her eyes never leaving her daughter. She watched every movement, as if witnessing Emily learn to walk for the first time in her life. She said nothing. She simply placed a hand over her chest, where her heart had not yet fully settled after the surge of emotion. Jack kept his distance. He didn't want to become the center of attention. He simply observed, adjusted, and listened. To him, this wasn't a performance. It was a process. In the days that followed, Emily frequently returned to the garage. Each visit, she walked a little steadier, a little straighter, a little more confident. And each time, Jack made minimal changes, an angle, a degree of elasticity, just enough for her body to keep moving forward. They talked more. Emily shared stories of her years in hospitals, the dreams she had once set aside. Jack listened without interrupting. Margaret watched from a distance and realized something that brought her peace. Jack wasn't selling hope. He was simply giving her daughter the tools to create it herself. Rumors began to spread through the town. People stopped their cars in front of the garage asking questions and looking curious. But for Emily, what mattered most was this feeling that each subsequent step she took, she no longer had to take alone. 1 week after the day Emily took her first steps, Margaret invited Jack to her home. Not for a loud celebration, but to say something she had been thinking about for a long time. The house sat on a quiet hill overlooking a vast valley. Everything was orderly, pristine, perfect, far removed from the dusty garage where Jack was used to standing. He felt out of place, as if his oil-stained shoes didn't belong there. Margaret led Jack into her study. She didn't circle the point. "You've done what no one else could," she said. "I want you to have all the tools worthy of that talent." She placed a concrete offer on the table, an official engineering position in her company, a high salary, a support team, and a scholarship for him to study any technical program he wished. Jack remained silent for a long time. He looked out the window, where sunlight fell across a perfectly trimmed garden. He thought about the small garage along Route 99, about the people who came by with old cars, with worried eyes because they couldn't afford repairs. About Emily, not in this house, but in the moment she stood up on the cracked concrete floor. "I'm very grateful," Jack finally said. "But I can't." Margaret froze. "It's not because I don't need the money," he continued, his voice slow but clear. "It's because if I leave, people like Emily, before she met you, will have no one left to look at them that way." He took a deep breath. "I don't want to become great. I just want people who can't afford it to still have a chance." The room fell silent. Margaret didn't try to persuade him further. She looked at the man before her, without fame, without ambition, and suddenly understood why her daughter had stood up in a place no one expected. "Then," she said softly, "let me help you in the way you choose." Jack nodded. No smile, no grand promises, just a quiet agreement taking shape, that from this point on, kindness would not be limited by status, and the right choices would quietly open a new path. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no banners, no speeches. Just a small sign hung up one quiet morning right outside a renovated old building on the edge of town. Turner Mobility Workshop, helping people move forward. Inside, everything was still simple, but unlike the old garage along Route 99, this place was brighter, more organized, and filled with tools Jack had once only dared to dream of. Not to get rich, but to do things right. Jack began seeing his first clients, not through advertising, but through word of mouth. A boy wearing leg braces that are far too heavy for his body. A middle-aged man injured in a workplace accident was forced to endure pain every time he stood up. A single mother bringing her child in, eyes caught between hope and caution. Jack treated them exactly the way he had treated Emily. He listened first, he observed first, and he acted only when he truly understood. Emily came to the workshop often. She was no longer the girl sitting silently on a plastic chair. She walked steadily now, confidently, her smile appearing more and more. She helped new families who arrived, telling them her own story, not to show off, but to reassure. "If I could do it," she would often say, "then you can too." Margaret did not appear often. She kept her promise to stay out of the spotlight. All support was quiet, unnamed. She understood that what she was protecting was not a project, but a person with a very fragile ideal, one that could shatter if exposed too strongly to the glare of fame. Doctors who had once shaken their heads at Emily's case began to seek Jack out. They examined the braces he built, astonished by their simplicity, by the way he let the human body guide the design instead of the other way around. Jack did not explain much. He simply said, "I fix things so they serve people, not so people have to adapt to them." And as each day passed inside that small workshop, it wasn't only the legs that were being better supported, but lives that were beginning to believe that hope, when placed in the right hands, it can go a very long way. One late afternoon, as the sun slowly sank behind the dry hills of California, golden light stretched across the entrance of Turner Mobility Workshop. Emily stepped outside, slowly but steadily. Each step was no longer an act of strain, but something natural she had once believed she had lost forever. Jack leaned against the doorframe, quietly watching. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. He simply watched, the way he had always looked at the world. Close enough to understand, far enough not to take someone else's moment away. Margaret walked up beside her daughter. She placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, not gripping tightly, not trembling as before. In the mother's eyes, fear had retreated, giving way to a rare sense of peace. She understood that the most precious thing was not that her daughter could walk, but that Emily had reclaimed her trust in the life ahead. Emily turned to Jack. "If that day you hadn't asked that question," she said softly, "I might still think that I was the problem." Jack shook his head. "You were never the problem," he replied. "The world just didn't look at you the right way." The three of them stood there, a poor mechanic, a billionaire woman, and a girl who had once been told she would never walk again. Their lives crossed not because of money or fame, but because of something far simpler: kindness placed in the right hands. That story never made the front page. It was never referred to as a medical miracle, but it spread quietly, through steadier steps, through families who dared to hope one more time. Because sometimes people don't need someone to fix their bodies. They just need someone patient enough to say, "You are not broken. You just haven't been helped the right way." Stories like this remind us that the most significant life changes, it often begins with very ordinary people. If this story touched you, leave a comment and share the moment that stayed with you the most. You never know. This story might reach someone who truly needs it. And if you believe in quiet kindness, in miracles that don't make noise, subscribe to Deep Life Tales. We'll meet again in the following story.